Series that we're calling Grounded, Finding God in the World. And I want to do something a little different today with you for about 15, 20 minutes here. We'll get out here. I'm looking to get out of here right about 12. And we'll just see if that happens. My granddaughter, we're baptizing my granddaughter, our second granddaughter. We're baptizing her in the chapel today with family and just some friends and Eleanor, and so I'm very excited about that. But that'll be happening a little bit later, so I'm not too rushed for that. But it seemed appropriate to be talking about water and all of that. And oddly enough, I'd forgotten about it. I'd forgotten that was happening, so that was also sort of coincidental, as those things may be. But I want to talk about water. Before I can talk about water, I want to talk about holy water. Before I can talk about holy water, I want to talk about holy. Holy. What does holy mean? Because I think that is where we sometimes mess things up. How we get grounded in what is holy when we sort of think of holy in what I think are somewhat limiting terms. Now, we tend to think of holy in adjective ways, adjectival ways. For example, we think of cow, Toledo, smokes, right? Mother of God. Right? We think of those things as if that really may, Holy Mother of God. And then there's one that we say a lot that we don't want to mention in here. And then hell, put your head around that one. It's one of my favorite ones. Holy hell. What? Can you just think about that for a minute? But we tend to do that. We tend to sort of think of it adjectively, or we tend to think of it in a verbal sense. And that's, our traditions go back. I mean, our Judeo-Christian tradition does this too. It's part of our human nature. It goes all the way back to what we were talking about with dirt last week. It's that need to control, that desire to control. It's part of our reptilian brain. It's part of our neurological makeup. So we tend to define reality based on our biology, and it's unavoidable. Sometimes, well, it is avoidable, but it takes a lot to sort of transcend even our own biology. But we tend to think of holy, I'll just put this word up here, holy first, as adjectives, right? All the different ways in which I call it sacred inflation. Yeah, sacred inflation. You can kind of play with that for a while as you start thinking about this during the week. Sacred inflation or sacred hyperbole. You know, we tend to do that. You tend to watch people, and we just accept it because there's a comfort in this kind of inflation. There's a comfort in this kind of hyperbole when we think of things as holy. This moment, this altar is holy. This space is holy. And that's the thing that we do with the verb part of it. When we think of it as a verb, we think of holy as consecrating. And again, it goes back to our traditions. In the church, we understand that. Consecration, consecrate, setting apart. We think of holy as kind of a setting apart of things. The problem with that is, again, that sometimes we get into this misdirection about how we look at holy. And we start thinking of holy as really being more of a value, right? So holy is good, bad is not. So we sort of give qualities to what is holy and what is not holy. So we talk about the secular world. The secular world. Or we talk about holy, the holy space, the holy world, the holy sanctuary, holy God. And so I think we get into trouble when we start doing this, when we start setting what God is apart. When we start saying, God is good, God is not bad. And I'm not trying to suggest that you say God is bad. I'm trying to suggest you stop doing that altogether. Right? But that's our tendency. Well, then you must be saying God is... And I say, stop being so bipolar, so dichotomous, right? It's like we set up these conflicts, these contradictions that don't have to be there. But we do that because it's our tendency. It's our biological nature. So what I want to think about is something different. It's in Isaiah 6, Isaiah 6:3, where Isaiah the prophet is talking to the people, and Uzziah the king has died, but it's been kind of a good reign. The king, everything centers around the king. That's where the kingdom language comes from several thousand years ago, 3,000 years ago, even further than that. Kingdom was kind of the established way, an imperial way of life, and everything revolved around the king. But you trusted the king. You trusted the king to make good decisions. You trusted the king to make ethical decisions. You trusted the king to think about the kingdom and everybody. But then Uzziah got sort of very self-focused, and after a while, it kind of went south. And the prophets began to rise up again, because the prophets always rise when what? Whenever it becomes evident that the kingdom is about a certain few and not about everyone. When getting to the river means you go through the valuation process of what is good or bad. You go through the holy process of what consecrates you versus what doesn't consecrate you. You go through the whole series of rituals in order to be a part of things, right? You adopt a certain orientation, creed, whatever. You begin to divide yourself from others. And the king had not only done that, he had begun to create this great inequality between the poor and those in power. And as a consequence, the prophets come up again, right? That's what Amos came up again, to rise up so that justice rolls down like a river, that righteousness is like a mighty water. You remember that verse? Who said that verse? Who was famous for that speech? Martin Luther King Jr., right? But it comes from Amos, because the prophets rise up again and cry out for justice, because it's not about just us, it's about all of us, right? So consecration sort of had this tendency to do that. I remember, I'm jumping around here, but I remember being at when I was in the Bible church, we had a group of men that did the praying for everybody else. And when they would meet over the issues of the church, and they were called the holy men of God. They were the holy men of God. They were the ones who were really disciplined and really righteous. But after a while, you got this feeling of, you just began, if you kind of stepped out of the reality, suddenly it felt like the holier than thou men of God. There was this way of sort of setting you apart from them. They have achieved this stature of what's right, how to think, how to behave, how to believe. They're the holy ones of God. You're not there yet. Keep working on it. We'll tell you when you get there. It's a complicated process when we start deciding who's in and who's not. When we start defining what is God and what God is not. So Isaiah comes up and he doesn't, as Uzziah has died, Isaiah does this prophecy thing. He has this vision, and he sees the King of heaven. He sees God at the throne of heaven, and all around God are these angels. And these angels are saying in verse 6:3, Holy, 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 the Lord God Almighty, heaven and earth is all, no, it says earth. It doesn't just say heaven. It says earth is filled with the glory of God. Holy, holy, holy. And this word holy is a cool word. It's kadosh. Can you say that word? Kadosh. Kadosh. I want you to say that word, because you're going to be saying that word a lot now for the rest of your lives. You better. Because this word has a tendency for people to think it means consecrated. It means set apart. But no, the earth is filled with kadosh. The earth is filled with God. The earth is filled with the glory of God. Holy, 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 kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. It's this idea that suddenly surrounding God is this holiness, is this holy presence. You remember when Moses stood at the burning bush and voice came out and said, take your shoes off. Joshua at the battle of Jericho, voice came out, take your shoes off. In all of these, Jeremiah, all of these prophets have reminded the people that where you're standing is on holy ground. Take your shoes off. It's as if they've taken and drawn a circle of angels around this big space and said, this is holy. Now think about that for a minute. Kadosh. So what I want to do now is I want to tell you quickly 5 stories. 5 stories, because what I want to play with you is this. I want to take this word holy, and I want you to start thinking about it a little differently, because we have this tendency to bifurcate or to dualize. Is that a word, dualize? It's a word, dualize. We have this tendency to put things into dualities because we have this tendency, like Adam and Eve, we want to control things, and so we aren't comfortable with mystery. We aren't comfortable with ambiguity. We aren't comfortable with tragedy and with difficulty. We got to blame something. We got to find a cause for something, and so we separate things, right and wrong, good and bad, holy and unholy. And I want you to think of holy in a different way. When we draw this circle kadosh around things, I want you to think of holy as holy. Okay? W-H-O-L-E, whole. I want you to think in terms of whole. The root words to holy and whole have the same sources. They overlap, and they often overlap with healing as well. Helan. So there's very different roots. They go different directions, but in some of their earliest usage, especially as it forms from the European into the English language, you get this idea of holy and whole have a similarity. Now I want you to think about this. If, in fact, we're thinking that holy has to do with how the whole is God, how wholeness is God, how completeness is God in some sense, then what is missing? Well, we think of then unholy, but what is unwhole? All right, unwhole. And what I want you to think about with that is, what is unwhole but a state of becoming whole? What is unwhole but an opportunity and the possibility of being made whole? What are tragic moments but God in the midst of tragedy seeking reconciliation or redeeming moments? Someone said to me the other day the most baffling thing when they were talking about the shooter and those kids who were shot and where was God. And someone said, God was in the shooter seeking wholeness. Oh, that's hard to take, isn't it? That's hard to understand. But that's where we're going. And I want you to hang on to it. I didn't say the shooter was good. I didn't say that what happened to the other kids or the teacher was good. Got to get away from that. We bump up into these mysteries all the time and we try to justify or argue or look for answers. How did that happen? Why did that happen? Where is God in the midst of all of this? And then we start bifurcating and we start dualizing and we start separating and then we start taking sides. And then we start tribalizing. And until we realize that we are all at the river. And we've got to open up and look at that with one another. Until we realize that's our starting point, then we continue to fall back onto God's this way or that way. So I'm going to give you 5 quick stories. And these are just sort of quick stories to think about, to sort of think about this whole, how we start thinking about God as whole. God is holy, God is whole. God is kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. I don't know if you speak Hebrew. If anybody speaks Hebrew and I'm saying that wrong, come up and tell me. Or don't tell me now. Correct me afterwards. So I want to think with you quickly about just 5 quick stories. And they're stories that kind of happened to me, and maybe this will give you sort of an example, because I want to use myself as an example of how I begin to understand this whole idea of holy. And so I've shared a lot of this kind of stuff with you in the past, but these are all sort of some quick news stories. Let me see if I can rapid fire through them. The first one happened in 1974. My father and mother divorced when I was very young. It was a very estranged family after they divorced. I was in 3rd grade and hadn't seen my father. He ended up moving to Belize. At the time, it was British Honduras, but by the time he got there, British Honduras was getting its freedom from England. It became Belize. My father went down there. He bought a little space, created a small, tiny hotel on an island off the shores of Belize, a little place called Ambergris Cay. And the village is called San Pedro. Some of you all have been on cruises. You go by San Pedro. You oftentimes go over there to this little island that's now become this big touristed area. He was the only hotel there with 3 rooms. And he called the place Paradise. My father was an abusive man. He was a sociopathic personality. He had wonderful tendencies. He had great qualities, but he was a really difficult person to be with. And I grew up with this kind of abuse. But when he had this place, I had this opportunity to go and see him. He says, I want you to come and see me, but come and see me here. See why this is paradise. And so I reluctantly went. I was like a sophomore in high school, 1974, maybe thereabouts. Yeah. And when I got there, you get off, then you get this little Casablanca kind of airport, that was in Belize City, and it was just air conditioned. I mean, no air conditioning, just fans going along, and just like a scene from Casablanca. And then I'm looking for my airplane, and then this little smaller jet with a 50-passenger jet starts to pull off, and there's my little single prop plane over there with a 6-seater on it, and a guy that's looking at me going like, are you here for Jerry McDermott? And I said, yeah, they know my dad on this island, on this mainland, and he's on the island. So already I'm thinking I'm kind of in trouble, but he says, well, I'm your ride. And I noticed the guy has a patch on one of his eyes. And I'm thinking, how do you fly a plane with a patch on your eye? But he does. He has a patch on his eye. And I'm thinking back of that movie Jaws. I think maybe the movie Jaws had just come out or something. And I'm thinking about the guy that's on the boat taking him out into the water to get that shark, you remember? And he's sitting there telling those guys the story about being in the military and how the 20 men were marooned in the water after the ship went down. And he kept saying, 20 go in and only one comes out. Because the sharks ate up all the rest of them. And I'm here with this guy, and we're sputtering over the water to this little island. And as we're flying over the water, we get to about 2,000 feet, and the guy's just strangely talking to me, and I'm trying to fathom the whole thing. I look down. The water's crystal blue. If you've been there, you've seen it. It's 15 feet, 20 feet at deepest inside the reef, and everything's inside the reef for a mile, half a mile or so. And I'm looking down, and I see these beautiful stingrays, right? Start going along down the water. And I look down, I see about 4 of them. And I said, wow, look at those stingrays. And he says, oh, those aren't stingrays. Those are manta rays. He said, you're 2,000 feet up above the water. Those things are 20 feet in diameter. And that just boggled my mind. Giant stingrays. I was like going over, this was Lost World. I'm headed over into dinosaur territory. And when we land, it's on this little dirt field. There's not even a runway there. And then my dad meets me, and it's not a good experience. It brings back all of the anxieties and the angers. And about 4 days into the trip, we haven't connected, and I'm just as furious as I thought I would be. And I find a little raft on the shore, and the reef is half a mile out, and it's only about 10 to 12 feet deep between here and the reef, and I get in the boat with a long pole, and I pull my way out to the reef, furious, and just looking for space. And as I get further and further out into the water, I'm looking down at the water, and I'm just looking over, staring, when all of a sudden I realize the water has, the sand below has dropped. And suddenly I think, this is much further than I thought it was deep. And I look back behind me, and I see some of the reef coming up above the water, but none just where I came through. And so I drop my anchor, and I can still see down, but as the anchor drops, which is about a 20-foot rope, it's just swinging back and forth in the water. And the current is carrying me further and further out into the water. And as I get further out into the water, I look at that island, and it's getting small. And I look out at the ocean, and it's getting huge. And I'm starting to panic. I'm no longer angry about my father. I'm now thinking I'm about to die. I'm going to be carried way out into the ocean, and nobody knows that I left, and nobody can see me, and nobody's out there around in their boats, and my anchor's not touching the ground, and I'm paddling furiously with my pole, trying to get back against the current. And I look down, and a manta ray is swimming underneath me. A manta ray. And I look down at it, and I remember the guy said, you don't have to be afraid of manta rays because they're really not, they eat plankton. They're like whales. They eat plankton and tiny fish. And I could actually see the mouth of this thing, which was huge, like 3 or 4 feet in diameter and 3 feet high, and it had these little things, that proboscis-like things that kind of bring in and funnel in the tiny fish. And it was just floating along underneath, maybe 15 feet below me, just enormous. But I noticed something. As it would move, the water would carry it out, and then it would paddle with its wings towards against the current, and then the current seemed to take it further, and its mouth would open to take in the plankton. And I thought to myself, that's what I have to do. I just have to catch the current as it comes in, and then maybe fight a little bit, but just catch the current as it comes in, and I'll have more control and direction. And it took about 3 hours to finally get back to the island. But by the time I got back to the island, well, I assume it took a long, long time. But by the time I got back to the island, I was at the other end of the island, completely carried all the way down to the end of the island where there was nobody. I was at least 1.5 miles or so from the little hotel in the little village of San Pedro, and I dragged my little plastic raft all the way back. And when I saw my father, my first thought was to be angry, but I was so overwhelmed with the manta ray and the whole experience and the fact that I survived the moment. And I looked at him and I said, I've just had the most hellacious, crazy experience. I thought I was going to die out there. And my father looked at me and he said, tell me what you saw. Story number 2. I was at a coffee shop this past week on Friday, and I was getting ready for this sermon. And I was sitting down having coffee. When I went up to ask the guy for coffee, the barista, I asked him, I said, I'd like an iced, iced latte with a couple of shots and then add some simple syrup and just lots of ice. He looked at me and he said, you know how cold it is out there? And I said, yeah, I want an iced drink. And he said, why would you want an iced drink when it's cold outside? And so I explained to him what I thought was a reasonable, logical explanation. I said, well, we're supposed to have about 64 ounces of water every day, right? And if I figure that there's probably about half an ounce or maybe a little less in every ice cube that you put in my coffee, then I figure I'm adding to that dose, to that amount of water that I need. So if I get about 20 ice cubes or 25 ice cubes, then I'm getting about 10 or 12 ounces of water in addition to the caffeine and coffee that I'm getting. So I get to enjoy my beverage and get water that I need. And he looked at me and he says, caffeine's a diuretic. And I just smiled and I said, put more ice in it. And I was working there, and I was doing the sermon, and it was rainy and misty out there, and I noticed this guy, about an hour into it, this guy was walking up and down the parking. And it was on Camp Bowie, and the parking were these spaces that come into the shops, right? He's not walking the sidewalk, he's walking at the edge of the parking spaces just along Camp Bowie. And he's talking to himself, and it's misting and kind of raining on him, and he's got a big old backpack and these baggy sort of brown khaki-like pants, and he's trudging along talking to himself, and I'm thinking, that guy must be freezing. And I was about to kind of go out and say if he needed something, maybe I had a raincoat, I don't know, I was going to offer him something from the car, but the phone rang. It was my son, which meant it could have been one of any 8 to 12 problems. And so I answered. And about 30 minutes later, I decided, all right, I got off the phone, I'd had enough, I needed a break, so I folded up everything, got in my briefcase, and started to my car. Here came the guy coming back. He was coming back down the road, and as he was talking to himself still, but it was still misting, and so I put the stuff in the car so it didn't get soaked, and then I started to kind of follow him, chase him down. I said, hey, mister. I said, mister, hey. And he just wasn't talking to me. He just ignored me. And finally, I said, hey, fella. And he stopped. He said, hang on a minute. He pulled the Bluetooth out of his ear. He looked at me, and he said, yeah, what's up? And I said, you're getting soaked out here. Do you need some help or anything? And he looked at me and he said, am I drowning? Story number 3. A good friend of mine had a daughter who was dealing with addiction. And it was a terrible thing. It was a horrible thing. It was very difficult. Some of you know that my family, we went through this with our oldest. It was really challenging, but I remember her telling me once, she said that while she was gone, her daughter was 19 and went on for several years, but now she's fine. She's been in recovery. She's now recovered in, I think, maybe 7-8 years now, clean. But she said while she was gone, there were times I didn't know where she was. She said it was terrifying. I would have these nightmares, she said, where I would see this murky water, and I was so terrified to walk up to the water because I knew that once I got to the water, once I saw the water, that there was a face that would start to surface. I would see that face start to surface. And I couldn't look. It just terrified me because all I could think of was my daughter, losing my daughter, drowning in the water, and the face would recede before I got up to it, and I would wake up in a cold sweat. She said, I had that dream all the time. She said, my daughter's back now, and I still occasionally have the dream. I said, really? Now still? But your daughter's back, everything's good. She said, yeah, because I did finally see. It wasn't my daughter's face, it was mine. Story number 4. There's a wonderful story in India about this magician named Pankar, D.L. Pankar, who was able to do this trick he called the magic water of India, where he would pull water out of the air, out of thin air. At the end of his shows, he would put a big glass bottle or jar on the table, and out of nowhere, after he waved his hand and did a few magical incantations, water would start to fill up in the jar, and he would invite people up to drink it. And people were fascinated with this. And of course, India is a country that has been for years experiencing various levels of drought all around the country. It's the second largest populated country in the world, over 1 billion people. 500 million people are said to actually practice open defecation because there's just no sewage, there's just no practical way of sanitation. 500 children are said to die every day because of lack of sanitation or clean water from diarrhea and dysentery and other diseases. Water's there, apparently. Last year, this guy who's from India, but he went to MIT and Berkeley, maybe you've read about this, came up with a device that sucks water out of the air. Only 20% humidity, dry air, arid air. After 4 or 5, 6 hours, it can pull out 1.5 liters of water. Has these extra metallic, weirdly porous materials that then take the water in, just soak it up right out of the thin air, and then reprocess it. They figure within another 5 years or so that they'll be able to provide water that comes seemingly out of nowhere. And he'll take it back to India, and he said, do you know what this will do? It will change not just the landscape. Women will start to go to school. Children will start to go to school instead of spending 4 hours trudging back and forth from the wells to find water. Last story. Alyssa Drillette and I, Tom Drillette, the bakers, I don't know, there's several other people. Kathleen Patterson's not in here, I don't think, right now. A number of us went on this trip to Ireland. Many of you knew about this, the trip that we took to create labyrinths at the borderline between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And we started at Glendalough, which is a beautiful, sacred, holy site, set apart, holy site. All you got to do is travel around Ireland and you start realizing everything around Ireland is holy, right? You know, the little mountain in the middle of the road, they're going like, don't touch it. That's where the fairies live. They won't put a highway through there. They're going to go all the way around it, right? I mean, everything is holy over there. But this place is specifically wonderful. I mean, it's really special because there's all these holy wells that St. Kevin, St. Cuthbert, St. Columba, all these different people sort of sanctified, and people would come and make Meccas and pilgrimages to these holy wells. Then they have these 2 beautiful lakes, and this large range of mountains surrounds the lake. And it's about 2,500 feet above the ground level. And so Elisa and Kathleen and I decide we're going to go hike this thing. Turned out it's like 13, 14 miles, the whole hike. Took us like 4 or 5 hours. It took a long time. But we stayed the course, and it was a beautiful hike, and those 2 women were like marching me into the ground. I'm like, stop, give me a break. And it was really fun, but it was kind of private. It was misty. It was a little cloudy, and we were hiking along these railroad ties. They had them paired together, and they were wet and moist, and so it was kind of treacherous at times. We would truck over these big, wide fields at higher elevations where the ground was the tradition. It was this old peat ground, right? And this peat turf has been there for hundreds of years. These things, it takes 100 years to recycle peat, which can be used for all sorts of things, cooking or fire and such. But then growing in the peat were this beautiful purple heather everywhere. So it felt like you were a little bit like Dorothy and the 3 other guys, you know, walking along through the heather. And so as we come over this beautiful, majestic, mystical kind of setting, looking down at the water below us, and we come over and there's this big grove of thick trees, you suddenly feel like just to your right are the Grimm's fairy tales. And sure enough, there's a path that goes down between some low-hanging trees and some wooden steps that sort of lead mysteriously down. And if you walk into the entrance, it just gets dark and still. And you feel like this could lead to that witch's place, you know, made of gingerbread, you know, and she wants to feed. And as I walk down about 50 or 60 yards, I can hear a little trickling, but I can't see anything because it just gets darker and darker and darker and keeps going down and down and down. So I finally decide I better go back and catch up with them. We get up to the top, and I catch up with them, and we start around the corner, and these 3 guys from, I guess they were from England. They may have been from Northern Ireland. College age, older high school maybe. They're yapping, and they come up over the hill, and they say, how much further do we have to go? And I said, well, you know, it's a long ways up. And then I stopped them, and I said, but just don't pass by this amazing entrance into the woods. It's like stepping into a Grimm's fairy tale, and they're kind of staring at me, and it's just magnificent, mystic. You go down into there, and there's a trickling stream. It's got to be magical or something. And I'm describing all of this, and he says, are you from Texas? And we said, well, yeah, we're from Texas. Yeah, we are. And he said, I love Texas. I said, you ever been there? And he says, no, but all my exes live in Texas. And Texas is the place I'd like to be. And they start laughing, and we're looking at each other like, all right, well, that was a waste. And they turn and start singing as they walk off. These stories, I have hundreds of these stories, right? Hundreds. You have hundreds of these stories. What's the difference? Maybe not for you, but for me, the difference is I'm expecting to have my mind opened. I'm expecting for something to connect. What's the thread in all of this? If you looked at all these stories, there's maybe not a thread. The guy that was walking along the thing that sort of was mad that I interrupted his phone call. My friend who's a drug-addicted daughter in recovery, but the face was her face. All of these things, sure, water's a central theme, but what really connects them is that as you start drawing these circles around these moments, as you start to recognize these moments, the pain, the suffering, kadosh, kadosh, the funniness, the curious, the goofiness, kadosh. As you start drawing these circles, you start to discover something, and I challenge you to do this. You start discovering you might as well draw a circle around everything because it's all kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. Band, y'all can come on up here. The encouragement that we have, that I think we get from this line from Jesus when he tells the man, you have to be baptized by water and the Spirit. I want to rethink that with you, that as you leave, you think about water and the Spirit, they're both God. What does it mean to be baptized into kadosh, kadosh, kadosh?